Hey, hello, and welcome to this episode of Learn Everyday English, your roadway to English proficiency. Again, we're in the studio today, my regular room in the house, and I think we have an interesting topic that we're going to discuss today, and I think you'll find it interesting, at least. And we're going to be talking about racism in America, or in the U.S., and basically my experience, and hope you'll like it. But remember, the first thing that you need to do are three things. One is to like the videos, 2, subscribe, and 3, you know what? That's right, tell your friends so that they can benefit from these videos too. Hey, just like you. Well, without further ado, without too much rambling on and on. Remember, rambling is like just to kind of talk and talk, to ramble on and on. I'm just going to get right to it, and get right into today's episode. So first I'm going to define what is racism. What is the definition of racism? And this is what I just did a quick Google search on the internet and found kind of this simple definition, or I could say this simplified definition of the word racism. So simplified means you just made something simpler, and you're saying something in more simple terms, so kind of makes it easier to understand. So racism, according to this definition, is the belief that different races have distinct is kind of like different or separate characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially so that we can just distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another. So those last few words are very important. We want to kind of distinguish people, characterize people, their qualities, so we can distinguish them. Distinguish between people means like to make a distinction, like to say there's a difference between one group or one race of people and another, for the purpose of saying that either they are superior, which are better than, or inferior, which is kind of less than one another. So basically it's just discriminating, if you've heard that word, discriminating against people based on maybe the way they look, the way they talk, the way they dress. It's discrimination, but racism is discrimination based on their race, or where they came from or come from, what country they're from, also kind of the color of their skin, that type of thing. So that is racism. So the question is, hey, is there racism in the United States? And my answer is definitely yes. And this is the views that I'm going to express here are my personal views or my personal opinion. But I think there's racism everywhere. In every country that you go to, there's some sort of racism. And here in the U.S., there's definitely racism. I'm going to kind of talk about my experience living here in the U.S. I'll be 60 years old in September, so I've lived here for quite a while. And I want to say, though, initially starting off, my experience here with racism may not be the same, or I know it is not the same as a lot of other people. Just so you know, I am an African American male, or as we say, I'm a black man living in America. Some people don't know or maybe cannot tell because I am what you would call a light-skinned black male, light-skinned. So I don't have real dark skin, but I am black or African American, and always have considered myself to be African American, and don't have a problem with that or saying that. And I'll tell you one thing very interesting that you may not know. And this was more common, we say back in the day, which means like a long time ago, which may have been like maybe the 1950s or the 1960s. There was a term called passing, P-A-S-S-I-N-G, and it was used like this. Sometimes they would see a person, they would say, "Hey, he's passing." Or I'll speak that loud. I said, "Hey, he's passing," or "she's passing." And you might wonder, hey, what does that mean? And I'll give you an example from my real life story. I remember I was a teenager, maybe 14, 15 years old, and my father had a cousin. We were living in Houston. My father had a cousin who was visiting from New York City. And I'd never met this person before, and he was like a distant relative, we say, a distant relative, which means a relative that is not very close. You're not close to each other. But he was visiting Houston and came over to visit, and I remember my mom told me, "Hey, he's passing. He's passing." And I asked her, "He's passing? What does that mean?" And she said, "He's passing as white." I said, "Passing as white?" And she said, "Yes, he's passing as a white person," which means he was pretending to be a white person, or actually he was living his life as a white man. So all of the people that knew him in New York knew him as a white man because his skin was very, very light. He looked like a white person. So he was saying to everybody, "I'm white." But he was actually African American. But we say people pass. He was passing. And people do that because they, I guess, want to have a better life, or they think that it will give them a better life if they're not considered a black person or African American person. They won't be treated like an African American person or a black person. They feel that they would be treated better. They can get a better job, maybe meet better people, have a more successful life. But I remember I told my mom, I said, why does he want to do that? You know, I just didn't understand as a teenager. You know, if you're black, you're black. You know, be proud of who you are. But some people, I guess, cannot do that or are not able to do that. And we say the verdict is mixed. Like, is there a benefit to do that? You know, you have to weigh that decision for yourself. Some people say it's worth it. Some people may say, no, it's not worth it. Because what happened, especially in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, people that decided to pass, black people that decided to pretend that they were white, they had to leave their families. And a lot of times they didn't associate with their black families again because that would, they didn't want anybody to find out that they had black families, black parents, black brothers and sisters. So to me, that's pretty sad. We say it's not a good thing to do, but that's my opinion. But continuing with racism and my experience here in the U.S., and it's different, say, from maybe the typical African American person because I am light-skinned and a lot of people don't know exactly what race I am. Some people think I may be Hispanic. Some people think I may be from the Middle East. And people don't know. But so I may not have experienced as much racism, say, as a dark-skinned black African American people, but I still have experienced racism. And that's because my father was in the Army. He was a military man. So I grew up living on military bases, we say. I lived for 5 years on an Air Force base in Nevada near Las Vegas, and then we moved to the East Coast, and we moved to the state of Maryland, and I lived on an army base there for about 5 years. So I have to say, living in the military on military bases, I did not really experience any racism that I can recall, because there were a lot of different races living there and mixing. There were blacks and whites and some Hispanics, and that was mainly it. So mainly blacks and whites, but like I said, I didn't really experience any racism until I was about 11 or 12 years old. And my father retired from the Army, and we moved to Houston. And I started living there in the early 1970s. And we moved to a neighborhood that was, we say, predominantly or mainly white. So that means most of the people living there were white, or we say Caucasian, white Americans. And I started experiencing some racism or prejudice, we could say. And people, I guess, knew that I was different. Maybe they didn't know exactly what race I was, but they could tell I was different from the maybe average person, or we were different than the average family that was living there at the time. I want to digress and jump back. My parents were from Louisiana, and my dad was very, very light-skinned. He was lighter than I am, but my mom was maybe darker skinned, African American woman. So I kind of came out in between, I guess you could say. But they were from a small town in Louisiana, and what I remember growing up in Louisiana, it was kind of backwards, we say. I thought the state was backwards, like it wasn't progressive, it wasn't with the time. There wasn't much, we say, mixing of the races. There wasn't much interacting or mingling with the races. The black people kind of stayed with themselves. The white people stayed with themselves. There were neighborhoods that most of the black people lived in. There were neighborhoods that the white people lived in. What I really found interesting, there was a park. There were two parks in the town where my parents grew up at. And there was a white park and a black park. So pretty much all the white people went to the white park, and the black people went to the black park. And what you could probably guess is that the white park was much nicer than the black park. The white park had better equipment, playground equipment for the kids to play on. They had a swimming pool that was really nice. The black park had equipment that wasn't as nice. It was more run down, we say, run down, which means it wasn't as nice. It was older, and they didn't have a pool. So there's a big distinction between the black and white park, or black and white parks. And I remember too that there were, my family was Catholic, there were 3 churches in the city. There was a big church, kind of old-fashioned, which is a cathedral-type church, and most of the white people went there. And there was a black church that most of the black people went to the black church. And there was a third church that was kind of mixed, and it was a newer church. But I thought it was odd that most of the black people went to one church, and it seems like most of the white people went to one church. And I do recall, I guess, one instance when I was a teenager that really impacted me with kind of racism. And those of you who are Catholic may know what I'm going to say. But usually in the Catholic, we say Mass or service, there's a point where you give the sign of the peace to one another, where you turn to the other person next to you or behind you, and you say, "Hey, peace be with you." You shake their hand. You extend your hand to shake the hand of the other person and say, "Hey, peace be with you." And they say, "Peace be with you." So I remember I turned around, and there was an older white couple standing behind me. And I remember the man was probably about 70 years old. And I remember I extended my hand to him to shake his hand. And he just stood there. He didn't move. He looked down at my hand, looked at me, and didn't do anything. He didn't try to extend his hand. He didn't try to shake my hand. He didn't acknowledge me at all. And that really disturbed me. I was really kind of like, wow, why is this guy doing this to me? We're in a church. We should act like Christians, and he is not, to me, wasn't acting like a Christian. He didn't want to shake my hand. And I consider that kind of an act of racism, because the only reason I could think of that he didn't want to shake my hand is because I was black. So those little things happen. We say they are not maybe strong things that show racism, but to me, they're the small things that we pick up on for racism. But then, like I said, we moved to Texas, we moved to Houston, moved into a neighborhood called Sharpstown that was predominantly white. And this is where I started to hear the N-word, And some of you may know what the N-word means. Some of you may not know what the N-word means. N-word means is kind of just the first letter of a word or name that some people call black people that is a racial slur, we say, or it's just a bad word, derogatory word to call a black person or an African American person. And what I'm going to talk about now is hopefully it's not offensive, but it's reality, so I'm going to say it anyway. And just so you may hear these words, but the N-word is the word nigger. And that's not a good word to say. So don't say that to anybody, especially don't say that to a black person or African American person unless you want to get into a fight or something like that. But I remember when I was living in this neighborhood in Houston, I was called the N-word on various occasions by different people. I remember, I'll give you some instances. We had moved in and I would ride my bike around the neighborhood, and there was a older boy that lived down in this house. His dad was white, but his mom was American Indian, so he was mixed. But I remember several times I would ride by and he would shout, "Hey nigger, hey nigger," and I was like, boy, this is a trip, which means like this is really something else. This doesn't make sense. This is a trip. Because this guy was half minority himself. His mom was American Indian. But here he was calling me the N-word. And the strange thing is I never met the guy. I never talked with him. I didn't know his name. He never met me. But he made a judgment call, and for whatever reason decided to shout this derogatory word at me. So I just let it go, and he stopped doing it after a while. I was also on another occasion, I was riding my bike around the neighborhood, and somebody shouted from a two-story house out the window. I couldn't see who it was. Then they said the same thing, "Hey nigger, hey nigger," and I was like, hey, what's going on here? For somebody that had never experienced this before, it was kind of shocking to me. And another time I was jogging around the neighborhood. I had some headphones on. On the other side of the street, there was a younger white girl and an Asian girl walking together. And I think they didn't know I could hear them because they thought since I had headphones on, I couldn't hear. And so the Asian girl was walking, and she said to the white girl, she was walking like this, and she said, "Hey, this is how a nigger walks." And then she said, "Oh, look, there's one there," pointing to me. And I just shook my head. I was older. I think I was in college by then. I just shook my head and didn't say anything. I said, it's really sad testimony. Here you have two younger kids, and they're talking like this. So these are examples of racism. And one other incident I had living in this neighborhood, I was riding my bike, and a pickup truck drove by me, and they had some white guys in it. I think two guys were sitting inside the truck, and there were two guys in the back of the pickup. We say in the bed of the pickup truck. And then they shouted something at me. I couldn't hear. And then one of them had a empty glass beer bottle, and they threw it at me. But luckily, with my cat-like reflexes, I ducked. This is to duck. I ducked very quickly and the bottle went over my head. But if I hadn't ducked, it would have hit me in the head. So this was another incident which I consider was kind of racist, because here I was, a black guy riding, and a truckload of white guys passed by, shout something which I think was offensive. I didn't hear it, and then they drove off. So these were what we call overt kind of examples of racism. Overt, which means like it's out in the open. You know exactly what it is. Then I went on to college, to the University of Houston, and studied engineering. And I remember the same thing. There wasn't any overt instances of racism, but most of the students that were in the engineering field, or the engineering classes, were white, probably 95% white. So a lot of classes, a lot of times, I was the only minority person in the class. And I felt too I was always having to prove myself, or to show that I could do just as well as everybody else. And I remember my brother, I have a twin brother who was going to college there at the University of Houston, studying electrical engineering. I was studying civil engineering. And we had a friend who was Asian, Vietnamese. And my brother told me one day, he said, hey, the friend, he told me something that kind of shocked me. And he said, he told him, hey, you're pretty smart for a Negro. You're pretty smart for a Negro. What does that mean? Like Negroes? A Negro is just another word for a black person. Does that mean black people aren't usually smart? So, we didn't hold it against this Asian friend. That means we didn't get mad or make a big issue out of it. Because what I've learned, a lot of people who don't grow up here, who haven't been exposed or been around a lot of black people, they have stereotypes. They have a way of thinking about people that usually a lot of times is not correct. So maybe he grew up thinking that, hey, black people just aren't quite as smart as Asian people. And he was just making a statement that he thought was true or valid. And I think hopefully he learned, I guess, since then, that, hey, black people, or Negroes, which is not a good word to use. It's not as bad as nigger, but we don't really call a person a Negro. To me, it's still not a good word to use. But, black people are just as smart as anybody else. Then I graduated from college, and I moved out on my own. A friend of mine, who was actually a Korean guy, we became very good friends, and still are very good friends today. We roomed together. That means we shared an apartment together. We lived in the same apartment. And I remember one day I was coming home from work, and there was a white lady in front of me walking, so I was walking behind her. But what struck me, or what made me kind of surprised, is she kept looking behind her like this at me. And then she had a purse in her hand, and then she said she clutched the purse to her chest like this. She held the purse, moved the purse, clutched it to her chest, kept looking behind her at me, and then started walking very fast. And I could only assume or think that she was scared of me because I was a black person, because there were not that many black people that lived in the apartment complex. So that kind of made me mad. It kind of pissed me off. To piss off means to anger a little bit, or to make mad or upset. Because why was she acting this way with me? I didn't know her. We had never met. We didn't know each other. I didn't say anything to her. But, those types of things happen in life. So those were some experiences that I had kind of with what I would consider racism. But like I said, I never experienced some overt racism as a teenager growing up. But as an adult, not really. Maybe some covert. Opposite of overt is covert, covert means like it's kind of hidden. It's not quite as obvious. because I graduated from college and I started working at the city of Houston, and I could tell, being in the field of engineering, I had to work with a lot of, say, white people in the engineering field, and most of them were very nice and it was fine, but every now and then, on occasion, I'd run into some people, and you know how sometimes you just get the feeling about something. So I could get the feeling that, again, I was always kind of trying to prove myself, or sometimes they were kind of shocked and surprised. They would talk to me over the phone. I don't really have much of an accent, or you can't really tell if I'm black or white or Hispanic, but I could tell sometimes they would see me and they would look a little surprised. And even one time, one person said to me, oh, you're Gary. And I said to myself, what does that mean? Did you expect something different? I don't look like what you imagined. And I assumed he thought I was maybe a white person. And maybe, so that type of thing happens. But, for the most part, I just try to ignore it, because they're the ones that have the problem and not me. And the last incident that happened that I want to mention is my wife and I, about 7-8 years ago, were planning our wedding. And so we were going to different wedding venues or locations to decide a location where we would have the wedding at. And I remember we went to this one location which was very nice, and it was a white lady, and she was nice. She showed us around, and we liked her place, so we wanted to have our wedding there. So she gave us all the information, said sure, no problem. We left. But as I was leaving, I remember her husband was outside working with some other guys, and he was not very friendly. I don't know if I said hello, he didn't say anything, he just looked at me, and I got a bad vibe. A bad vibe means a bad feeling from him, that he was not a nice guy, or he didn't like me, just for whatever reason. And so maybe a couple days later, I had to call her to arrange or talk about some details, and she never would answer the phone. She never called me back. I called and called. Finally, one day I reached her. She answered. She said, oh, I'm sorry, I'll get back with you. She never got back with me. I called and called. She never returned my call. So this went on for maybe 3 to 4 weeks. And I realized that she was just avoiding me. She didn't want to talk to me. And finally I realized, hey, well, she doesn't want us to have our wedding at her wedding facility. She just didn't want it. And I thought back, I said, well, yeah, that makes sense, because her husband, something about him, he wasn't very friendly and open. And and my wife is Hispanic, so I have to assume that she didn't want minorities having their wedding at her facility. So these are, other instances. I consider them, instances of discrimination and racism. I can't really prove it, but this type of thing happens a whole lot. So those are instances that I've had consider with racism and discrimination here in the U.S., but like I said, I don't consider those maybe as serious or as many types of instances as a lot of people here in the U.S. have experienced. So maybe in one respect, I'm lucky. But I want to close out this episode with phrases that are used in a derogatory sense to refer to other races. So we know as black people, a bad word to use is nigger. And I want to talk about that word just briefly. Where does that word come from? And it's a word or racist slur used against black people, like I said, considered really offensive. But, it's interesting that a lot of times African Americans can use this word in music, rap songs, and it's considered maybe okay. They don't get as offended. A lot of times they use the word nigga, and to each other, or sometimes they'll call each other, hey, my nigga. And, it's okay. I don't use these words myself, but I know in the black community I've heard it, and people refer to each other like that, and it's okay. but apparently they can do it because, they're in the black or African American community. So it is interesting how the word is offensive when used by, certain people and not offensive within the African American community. But I think the word originated around the 18th century from what I could tell, and it is an adaptation of the Spanish word negro, meaning black. I think it originally came from a Latin word and then the Spanish word, which was fine, but over time it started to have this negative meaning, this negative connotation. But there are other words that, just for your information, that are used in the United States to refer to other races in a negative way. And these are just some words that I heard growing up, say as a kid or a teenager, as a young adult. And I don't use these words either, but just so you know, for informational purposes. And, don't use these words, but just so you'll know what they are. And a lot of times, so the first word, and these are words that are used to refer to like Middle Eastern people, Arab people, maybe Muslim people. The first word is camel jockey, and that's a negative slur used to refer to Middle Eastern or Arabic people. Also, another bad word or negative word or phrase that's used is towel head, used for Muslim people, Arab people, or Sikhs, because they have a form of covering over their head. And the third term that's used is sand nigger, to refer to Middle Eastern people. So in case you hear those somewhere. The next set of words or phrases has to do with Hispanic people, but the first one specifically has to do with Mexican people. And the term is called wetback, a wetback. And that's because people say, there's the Rio Grande River that divides Texas from Mexico, and people say, well, they have to swim across the river so their back gets wet. It's really cruel to say that, but that's where the term wetback comes from. There's another term that's used to refer to, say, people with brown skin. And sometimes they are called a coconut because their coconut is brown on the outside and white on the inside. And it means like a brown-skinned person that wants to be or is trying to be white. So the person is called a coconut. There are words that are used to describe Asian people here in the U.S. One word is called gook, and the other is chink. Gook and chink. These are referred to East Asian people, like people from China, say Japan, Vietnam. Also the word Jap is used to refer to Japanese people. And we also have a food that's used to refer to Asian people. And sometimes they are called a banana, because a banana is yellow on the outside and white on the inside. So banana, if you call an Asian person a banana, it means you're saying, hey, well, they're an Asian person that wants to be or is trying to be white, because they're yellow on skin is yellow on the outside, but inside they're white. They want to be like a white person. Another term that I heard growing up was dago, and this is a negative word used to refer to Italian people. And then I guess there was also negative words that used to refer to white people, and I have heard these used by black people to talk about white people. And one of the first word is called cracker. Oh, he's just a cracker. Cracker is like cracker you eat, but in this term, it means like a negative word for a white person. The second term is called honky. That's Honky. So those are negative words used to describe other races. So I think that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed this, found it interesting. And, I want to say that, there is racism here. Maybe I don't say it's worse than any other place, maybe any other country, but here, we have a special situation in a way because we do have so many different cultures, so many different races here. And, whenever you have that happen, some people get jealous, some people become fearful because these other people are coming to our country, to my country. They're taking over, they're taking our jobs. We have to pay for them, give them services. The government has to give them services, and that's where all our tax money is going. So it becomes kind of a real negative thing. And during this whole COVID situation and outbreak, since COVID, started in China, the incidents of violence against Asian Americans or Asian people here in the United States has gone up significantly, or has increased a lot, because people are taking their anger out on Asian people, which is not fair. So that is happening here as well. So again, let me know what you thought of this video, and two, let me know, and this is something really I am interested in and really want to know, is there racism in other countries? How is racism in your country? Is there a lot of racism in your country? If you have one ethnic group or one race predominantly, I'm assuming there's not that much racism, but if you have a lot of different races, like now in England, I know Germany, France, maybe even Spain, what is it like there with a lot of different races and racism? Is it racism based on ethnicity, people from other countries? Or is it racism based on skin color? Let me know in the comments. Send me a line, drop me a line. So that's it. So remember, you need to do 3 things for me. I can keep these videos going. It really helps me out, and it encourages me. It makes me feel good that these videos are helping, and I want to continue making them. So remember, like, subscribe, and tell your friends. So that's it for today on this episode of Learn Everyday English. Have a good day, week, wherever you may be in the world that we live in, and I'll talk to you later. Hey, goodbye.